Perhaps the most serious objection to Papias' witness to the authorship of the Gospels is that he is just known to be incredibly unreliable elsewhere. Bart Ehrman explains, "There is, though, still a further and even more compelling reason for doubting that we can trust Papias on the authorship of the Gospels. It is that we really cannot trust him on much of anything." Ehrman goes on to cite the following passage preserved in Apollinaris of Laodicea and allegedly from Papias as evidence for his unreliability. "Judas walked about in this world as a weighty example of impiety. He was so inflamed in the flesh that he could not pass where a wagon could easily pass. In fact, not even the bulk of his head alone could pass. For they say that the lids of his eyes were so swollen that neither could he see any light at all, nor could a doctor, aided by instruments, see his eyes. Such was their depth from the outer surface of his body. His genitals appeared to be more nauseating and enlarged than any other genitalia, and he passed through them pus and even worms that converged from throughout his body, causing an outrage on account of a simple necessity of life. After many tortures and punishments, they say, he died in his own land. His land remains until now desolate and uninhabited on account of the stench. Even to this day, no one can travel through that place without holding their nose. So great was the judgment that spread through his flesh upon the earth." Ehrman goes on to drive his point home, saying, "Does anyone think that Judas really bloated up larger than a house, emitting worms from his genitals, and then burst on his own land, creating a stench that lasted a century? No, not really, but it's one of the two gospel traditions that Papias narrates." Ehrman goes on to cite another example from Papias, preserved through Irenaeus, to demonstrate Papias' unreliability. "The Lord taught in regard to those times, and said, 'The days will come in which vines shall grow, having each 10,000 branches, and in each branch 10,000 twigs, and in each true twig 10,000 shoots, and in every one of the shoots 10,000 clusters, and on every one of the clusters 10,000 grapes. And every grape, when pressed, will give 25 measures of wine. And when any one of the saints shall lay hold of a cluster, another shall cry out, I am a better cluster, take me, bless the Lord through me.' In like manner, he said, that a grain of wheat should produce 10,000 ears, and that every ear would have 10,000 grains, and every grain would yield 10 pounds of clear, pure, fine flour, and that apples and seeds and grass would produce in similar proportions, and that all animals, feeding then only on the productions of the earth, would become peaceable and harmonious, and be in perfect subjection to man." From this passage, Ehrman argues, really? Jesus taught that? Does anyone really think so? No one I know, but does Papias think that Jesus said this? Yes, he absolutely does. The only traditions about Jesus we have from his pen are clearly not accurate. Why should we think that what he says about Matthew and Mark are accurate? Richard Carrier makes similar points, saying, as expected, the things which Papias tells us are ridiculous. For instance, one excerpt we have tells us this absurd story about Judas. Papias also said that Jesus promised us vast clusters of gigantic grapes and other nonsense. Clearly the legends and fabricated sayings had gotten out of hand by the time Papias wrote, and he just believed whatever he chanced to hear. Does Papias come anywhere near to telling us anything useful? Not really. Given that this is probably the most popular, as well as the most serious objection to Papias' testimony to the authorship of the Gospels, I will devote a significant amount of space to answering it. I will begin by assessing the remarks about Judas, before moving on to assess the teaching about grapes and vines which is attributed to Jesus. Regarding Judas, the defender of Papias can make several points by way of response. In the first place, this record of the death of Judas attributed to Papias is quoted twice by Apollinaris of Laodicea. But what Ehrman and Carrier fail to mention is that it reads significantly differently in those two places. Skeptics, of course, prefer the lengthier, more exaggerated version because it allows them to more easily discredit Papias. But in another place, Apollinarius quotes the same passage from Papias, but it only reads as saying, Judas lived his career in this world as an enormous example of impiety. He was so swollen in the flesh that he could not pass where a wagon could easily pass. Having been crushed by a wagon, his entrails poured out. While the similarities between both quotations are unmistakable, there is a pretty clear discrepancy. In the longer quotation, Judas is only compared to a wagon and seemingly killed by worms, but in the shorter quotation, he is killed by a wagon. So the question arises, which version is more true to Papias? It is, after all, much easier to see Apollinaris as substantially exaggerating what Papias said in the longer quotation than it is to see him deliberately toning down what Papias said in the shorter quotation. In short, it's unclear how much of this tradition actually goes back to Papias himself. Things are not quite as neat and clean as skeptics like Ehrman and Carrier make them out to be. As Monte Shanks observes, the fact that this fragment was assimilated from a collection of quotes from Theophylact as he interacted with Apollinaris' quotes of Papias makes it difficult to regard either of the above conjectures as accurate reflections of what Papias actually wrote. The second point to raise is that we, as modern readers, do not have the context of this quotation from Papias. Papias might have been trying to harmonize a local urban legend with the record of Judas's death in the New Testament for all we know. We do not really know that he is reporting this as a historical fact in the way that Ehrman and Carrier assume that he is. Perhaps he is, but then again, perhaps he is not. As a third point, we must not overlook the possibility that Papias may be engaging in a type of ancient rhetorical exaggeration known as Ekphrasis, which would have instantly been recognized as such by his original readers. As Christopher B. Zeichmann argues, Aphthonius' lessons on the topic confirm that Papias' death of Judas is an ekphrasis. Though writing after Papias, his handbook offers the most comprehensive delineation of the perfect ekphrasis. He declares that when making an ekphrasis of persons, one should go from first things to last, that is, from head to feet, and in describing things, say what preceded them, what is in them, and what is wont to result. Papias does precisely this. His description of Judas's body begins at the head and works its way down, while simultaneously writing with linear chronology. Papias' central concern in this passage was the description of Judas immediately before his death, but he also narrated events before his disease struck and after his death. To sum that up, we don't really know what Papias was trying to say in this fragment, nor do we know how much of it is genuine to him. But in any case, it is far from clear that this is a straightforward case of Papias being unreliable. As such, it is very tenuous for skeptics to make this passage the cornerstone of their objection to the reliability of Papias. Shanks reminds us, there is little agreement on the exact content and meaning of this fragment, let alone its original context. Without further Papian material, certitude is not possible. Consequently, while data found in this fragment is interesting, it is one of the least credible Papian fragments. Turning now to the words ascribed to Jesus by Papias, it is critical to observe from the outset that Papias is by no means the only person to have attributed this to Jesus. Irenaeus has multiple other sources besides Papias and Against Heresies 5.3. As Richard Bauckham points out, we must begin by investigating the sources from which Irenaeus drew this material because, as we shall see, Papias was not the only source. Irenaeus introduces his quotation of Jesus as saying by attributing it to the elders. Some scholars have argued that Irenaeus is here identifying Papias as the source from which he has taken the tradition of the elders, but several considerations rule this out. In the first place, Irenaeus says quite clearly that Papias is an additional witness to the saying he has just quoted from the elders. Papias bore witness in writing, whereas the elders reported orally what John had said. The distinction need not mean that Irenaeus knew the tradition of the elders only as an oral tradition, though this is possible. He could have known it in a written source, but the contrast with Papias would be that the elders themselves did not write the tradition down, whereas Papias did. So Irenaeus first quotes from the elders, then introduces Papias as an additional witness to the same saying of Jesus. Bauckham goes on to point out that these words are also attributed to Jesus in the writings of Hippolytus. So the idea that Jesus said this seems to have been quite widespread among early Christians. I am of the somewhat controversial opinion that because this saying seems to be independently attested by so many early witnesses, it may indeed be an authentic saying of Jesus. While Jesus is obviously speaking in metaphors here, There is absolutely nothing theologically objectionable in his words from an Orthodox Christian perspective. And if the Gospels are giving us anything like an accurate picture of Jesus, it would not be at all out of character for Jesus to speak using these kinds of metaphors. There are no real problems which arise for the Christian in accepting that Jesus really said this. Note that I am not saying that Christians necessarily ought to adopt this as an authentic teaching of Jesus. I'm simply pointing out that there is much more evidence for this teaching than Papias' testimony alone, and that there are no real theological difficulties involved in doing so once we recognize that Jesus is not speaking literally. But put everything that I have said about these two problematic passages in Papias aside for a moment. Let us suppose that Ehrman and Carrier are right that Papias is just transmitting outright falsehoods as matters of fact in these passages. Does this undercut the credibility of what he tells us about the authorship of the Gospels? I think that it does not. Whatever else we may make of these problematic passages, it is clear that, as is the case with his testimony bearing on the Gospels, Papias is merely passing on an earlier tradition. Papias is the conduit which conveys these pieces of information to us, but he is not the source of any of them. Thus, even if the source of the story about Judas is completely unreliable, this does not automatically make John the Elder, who is Papias' source of information about the authors of the Gospels, unreliable as well. The trustworthiness of the information from a source is not and cannot be determined by the conduit which brings that information to us. As Charles Hill rightly concludes, there is no reason to doubt that Papias is a faithful reporter of what he heard and memorized, though there may be very good reason to doubt the historical factuality of much of what he reported. His reports should not be treated as automatically true, but neither as automatically legendary. They are early testimonies to what was known or believed at that time, no matter how much actual truth they contained.